Okay, thanks. So today I want to talk about causal loop diagrams. Like last week, in fact, actually the next slide will take us through that. So over the last couple of weeks we've talked about these topics. 2 weeks ago we were talking about visual management and why it's a kind of useful tool for all kinds of reasons. And then last week we were talking about two things: Kaizen, which is the process of continual improvement, and the balanced scorecard, which is a way of doing visual management specifically in the context of strategy. So that was looking at the kind of value of visual management. This is Kaizen. If you just want a reminder of the detail, you set a goal, you define how you'll know if you've achieved that goal, you take some action, and ideally the action that brings you as soon as possible to some data that will validate whether or not you're getting closer to the goal or not. You review what the action achieved, where did we get to, did we get closer to success or not, and then you decide what you're going to do next and you repeat. So that's a kind of useful tool that can be applied in several ways. It comes from the Toyota process, and in there are kind of two different horizons for a process of ongoing improvement. There's the kind of short-term horizon of little kind of experiments that last a couple of weeks or whatever, and then there's the longer-term horizon of the vision for where the company's going. But they're both a similar sort of thing. They're setting a goal, saying how will we know if we've achieved it, what action is going to get us to some knowledge about that quickly, and then taking that action and reviewing. And the balanced scorecard was composed of two things. It's this objective map, which is looking at the various strategic objectives that are linked together that a company has, and it's a destination statement, which is a kind of picture of the vision of the company for the future. And those two things sit together. So I just want to orient us in where we have all of these bits of knowledge and where the stuff that I'm going to talk about today comes in. So visual management, there are the kind of two kinds of visual management. There's the workflow Kanban, which is up behind you, and there's the balanced scorecard. So those are both kind of different ways of doing visual management of stuff. Kaizen is a way of thinking that has kind of lots of different applications, but it also feeds into the balanced scorecard, which is why I talked about it last week. Right? The idea with the balanced scorecard is that you see all the various objectives that you're trying to achieve, and you work out what are the little experiments that I'm going to run to try and move us towards those objectives. And similarly, each of your objectives fits into your kind of longer term destination statement as a way of saying, oh, these are the things that we think are going to move us closer. So we could maybe expand a little bit like this and say that the balanced scorecard has these two components: destination statement and objective map, which are about the long-term and the short-term horizon, and they're both a form of kind of Kaizen, both a form of a process of ongoing improvement. And today I want to talk about causal loop modeling, which fits in more neatly to that kind of objective map, and is also, like Kaizen, is a kind of way of thinking. It's a tool that can be applied in lots of different ways. It's not just limited to this stuff. So all of the things over the last kind of 3 weeks fit together in a picture, but there are bits in there that can be taken out and used separately as well. Okay, so today's topic, causal loops. Causal loops are a way of visualizing a system. The thing about visualizing is it's about thinking and talking about stuff. Right? The first rule of modeling is that the discussion is more important than the diagram. The purpose for having causal loop as a kind of tool is to help you think out loud yourself, or to think out loud with others. And actually thinking out loud with others and discussing the system as a group with other people who are in the system is a really important part of a kind of like well-functioning open culture business. Systems are, they're an assembly of mutually interacting parts which leads, as I've said many times before, to emergent properties. So the way that the things interact creates a kind of flavour or feeling or characteristic that the system has overall that isn't in any of the individual parts, but arises from the parts and their interactions. So causal loops is a way of looking at the parts and interactions in the system to try and understand what some of the properties it might have are. Right? They're fairly simple diagrams. They have a few basic components. There are variables, which are nodes, kind of points in the diagram. There are the causal links, which is the edges or the lines between them. There are polarities, which can be plus or minus, and we'll see what they mean in an example I'm about to run through. There are delays. And finally, there are feedback loops. And delays are represented by these kind of double bars. So let's take an example, and then you'll see those things in action, and you'll kind of see what it is as a tool and how you might use it. So one way of looking at it is to say, okay, let's talk about population size. As population is increased by birth, right? The more births there are, the more populations there are. So we have these two nodes, and we have a causal link between them, births and populations, and we have a polarity, we have the plus sign. So what that means is the more births there are, the more the population grows. The fewer the births there are, the slower the population grows. Okay? Population is decreased by deaths. So the more deaths there are, the slower the population grows. So it's got a negative sign there for the polarity. It's the opposite effect of the interaction of the two variables.
Is it the slower the population grows or the lower the population is?
It's both, isn't it? Births increase population. So the more births, the higher the rate of births, the higher the rate that the population grows. Deaths decrease population. So the higher the rate of deaths, the higher the rate that the population decreases. So yeah, more deaths, smaller population. More births, bigger population.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Okay, so rate of birth linked to rate of population and rate of and birth linked to population.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we can put those two things together and say that population is affected by these kind of two variables, and it's going to grow when we have births, and it's going to shrink when we have deaths, right? That's a really kind of simple starting point. But a question we might say is, are there any other links between population, births, and deaths other than this, right? So here's something that we might look at. The bigger the population, the more births there are after a delay. Because there are more people in the population, it's a bigger breeding group, right? So you're going to get more births as a result of that. Similarly, the bigger the population, the more deaths you're going to get after a delay. Right? Because with a bigger group of people, everybody has to die at some point. So the number of deaths is going to go up at the end of people's lifespan, or whenever that is, and it's going to be, distributed. So what we have now is we have the beginning of some feedback loops. So more births, bigger population after delay, more births. So because we can follow these arrows round without changing direction, we've got a loop here, and it's going to reinforce itself over time, right? Because each of these things is a positive effect. Yeah? Or we could say that via the interaction with population, more births today means more births in the future. Right? There are different ways of reading what that reinforcing looks like. Or we could say, via an interaction with birth, an increase in population today will lead to an increase in population in the future. Right? So there's quite an interesting dynamic that evolves around that. And there's a balancing loop on this side. Right? What this means is, via the interaction with death, an increase in population today will lead to a stabilization in population, because the bigger the population is, the more deaths there are. Or, via the interaction with population, more deaths today means fewer deaths in the future. Right? It's a balancing loop. It's seeking a goal. It's stabilizing the system.
So what's the two lines again?
Delay.
The delay.
Okay.
Yeah? Because we wait to the end of the life cycle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know what the handsets were
Amazon.
Amazon was it?
Yeah. So we basically have these kind of two feedback loops that are interacting here in this system, right? But is there a bigger system that we can expand even from there? Yeah, there is. Okay. So this is in the context of a resource-constrained country, and it's always important when looking at these diagrams to know what the particular context of the model is. So we have these loops that we were looking at already, and then we have another one which says, okay, as the population increases, the resources per person will decrease. As the resources per person will decrease, life expectancy will decrease. Because this link has a positive polarity, a decrease on one side means a decrease on the other, right? So as the resources per person decrease, life expectancy will decrease. As life expectancy decreases, the number of deaths will increase, because that's kind of what it means at a population level. When you have a lower life expectancy, you have more deaths, right? In the current population that you have. If in a given set of population the life expectancy goes down over any given period, there will be more deaths. So what we have is a second balancing loop acting in this system. But there's also a second reinforcing loop here, because as the population increases, and the resource per person decrease, and the life expectancy decreases, the decreased life expectancy can lead people to have a larger desired family size. You want to have more children because with a decreased life expectancy, it's more likely that they will die young and they won't be able to support you, right? So you want to have more children. And that means that because as the desired family size increases, birth per person increases, there are more births, and we have a second reinforcing loop that's running around like that. So this is basically how causal loop modelling works, is we're trying to look at the system and the dynamics that are operating in the system. And we're trying to say, okay, well, what are the variables going on here? How do they interact? And where are the reinforcing loops in this system? Right? Because reinforcing loops are really powerful. And we can try and do things that act against them, and we will find that the system's reinforcing loops will assert themselves and will kind of drive things on. So what we want to do is we want to act, if we want to change the dynamic of the system, we need to act in a way that changes the dynamic of the loops, rather than just kind of locally on any particular node. Right? So that's the basic vocabulary. The nodes, the causal links, the polarities, the double bars for the delay, and the two different kinds of feedback loop. There are a few bits of extra vocabulary. You can use stronger lines, you can use thicker lines for things that have a strong effect. If you're not quite sure whether something is going to apply, you can put a question mark against an effect that you want to test. You can also put a C for a constraint. Constraint is something where you cannot have more X without more Y, but more Y does not mean more X. So you cannot hire more people if you do not make more money in order to pay for them, but making more money does not necessarily mean that you're going to hire more people. So the amount of money that you make is a constraint on the number of people that you can hire, right? So it's a slightly different kind of interaction. We can also model interaction effects with lighter lines, or here's a kind of an example. So there's a constraint. Oh yeah, cash supply to number of developers. Great, so that's a constraint. This is an interaction effect. So this is an effect that's saying cash supply affects the interaction between these two things. It doesn't affect the kind of individual variables, it affects the line that's linking them. So that can be a useful tool as well in kind of trying to understand what's going on. Now what emerges from the kind of modelling of systems and the feedback loops is a number of archetypes. And I'll post some links about this, there's some kind of background reading, or I can talk about it another time. You get different systems which have different tendencies as a whole. So obviously a system where the kind of primary driver is a reinforcing loop is going to go for exponential growth or exponential decline, because it's just going to keep going round and round. A system in which there's a balancing loop as well is either going to tend towards that goal, or if it has a delay in it, it's going to oscillate in some way. If you think of like a boiler and a thermostat, that's a balancing loop where there's a delay. So the room gets too hot and then the boiler is turned off. But it's not an instantaneous effect. So it'll oscillate around the right temperature. These are basically also variations of interactions with the two kind of oscillations. There are other ways of kind of modelling the archetypes that come out of systems, and there are something like a dozen of them that apparently are kind of quite common ways of looking at this stuff. So, what? Sorry, what? What?
Terry's back on again. Sound went off for a second.
I have no idea what's happening.
Carry on, the sound went off for a second.
Are you okay, buddy?
Great. Okay. These are some of the kind of like archetypes, and you can put these together in kind of causal loops. They're quite interesting. I think addiction is one in which you're essentially trying to solve a surface problem, and the solution that you apply to that surface problem has a side effect, and that side effect has an impact on the long-term ability to solve the fundamental problem. So addiction is a system in which a quick fix is being applied in a way that erodes the resources of the system to solve the ultimate problem. Right? A kind of practical example is, the more that we try and connect with other human beings through technology, the less time we spend connecting with other human beings, right? And the more we become trapped in a cycle of using technology as the way that we connect with people. And we start to connect with people less face to face. That's the kind of addiction cycle. Drift to low performance This is a really common phenomenon, which is people tend to remember bad news better than good news. So there's an interaction between how we want things to be and how they are, but there's also an interaction between how we think things are and how they actually are. And because we tend to remember bad news more than good news, we tend to have a picture that things are worse than they actually are, right? If we think about, there's a kind, this happens here, that we have a picture that, like things are kind of nightmarish or difficult or unsuccessful or inefficient because of open culture, whatever it is, and then you look at the actual kind of financial performance of the business and you see that we're doing really well, right? Because we remember bad news better. So, and the point is that the interaction between how we think things, how we want things to be, and how they are, is a two-way interaction. So if we think that things are worse, then that's going to start to affect the standard that we're holding. So you get this drift of standards over time. As you look around and you think, oh, things are worse than, things are kind of terrible, then you start to shift your perception of how you think things should be in response to that. So that's kind of drift to low performance. Escalation, that's clearly like the cycle in which things, you just have a kind of reinforcing loop. And it can go two ways. You can have the kind of price war escalation, but you can also have the success of the successful, which is the phenomenon by which, whatever it is, 1-2% of the world's people control 80-90% of its wealth, because wealth generates wealth with reinforcing loops. Limits to growth, that's when you have a reinforcing loop that meets a balancing loop. So the great example of this is a forest fire. Right? A forest fire grows and grows and grows. That's a kind of reinforcing loop. But also as the forest fire grows, it consumes the resource that it needs in order to survive. And so eventually, that rebalancing loop of the fact that it's consuming all of the wood means that it goes out. So what seemed like this kind of massive cycle of growth suddenly starts to peter out and maybe even kind of tail off in one of these kind of scenarios. Either it kind of has a disastrous collapse. And the tragedy of the commons, which is the situation where the value of using a shared resource outweighs the individual cost. So, for instance, the kind of like the not doing the washing up is an example of a tragedy of the commons loop, because the cost to you of putting something dirty in a sink and not doing it is lower than the cost to the group of
I think the tragedy of the commons is a group of people out of fear overusing their individual share of a resource to the point they consume it quicker than they need to, and then it becomes unsustainable.
Thank you.
Jesus Christ!
How was that related to the dishes?
That's like that was my MSc. Economics.
I will follow up with an example of how that explains dirty dishes. There's a really good.
So I'm just giving them trees on Easter Island.
Trees run perfect.
Yeah.
Cutting them down until they all die because they have no wood.
Brilliant. Okay, so the point is that each of these is kind of archetypes of the overall dynamic of the system. And essentially we can reduce each of these archetypes to saying, it's like there's an interaction of a particular reinforcing loop and a particular rebalancing loop with or without a delay. Right? So it's quite simple, the components that we're working with here, but we come up with kind of system characteristics that we're familiar with, but now we see the ways in which they're being assembled. We understand the things that are driving with them, and we're able to kind of start to work with them. So here are some other examples of kind of causal loops, right? This is quite an interesting one. This is the one that CBT is built on as a therapy, which says that your mood affects your desire to do stuff, your desire to do stuff affects you actually doing stuff, and your doing stuff affects your mood, right? It's really interesting, this one, because the way in which kind of CBT works as a therapy for depression is understanding that you can actually influence this system here, right? If your mood is low and you don't want to do stuff, by doing stuff you will lift your mood. So you don't have to, because generally speaking, when you're depressed, you think, well, I have to change my mood, and you're stuck in the fact that you can't change your mood. So actually saying, well, you can do some stuff, and that will generate the desire to do stuff. Right? But this is also the loop which says, somebody who's already busy is the best person to get to do stuff, because they're already in a kind of like doing stuff is energizing. Doing stuff lifts your mood, it creates the desire to do more stuff. Right? That's an interesting loop. This one, which I talk about all the time in the collusion diagram, this is also a reinforcing loop. where we have one bit of behaviour reinforcing another bit of behaviour going round. So you act in a way that causes me to act in a way, and it becomes a dynamic that reinforces itself and grows. This is also a kind of this is like a work-related example, and I just want to. This is actually from a website that talks about the development of Microsoft Word as a product. So I just want to walk us kind of through this diagram because it's a bit more dense.
For now, it's very hard to read even from here. I suspect the background.
Do you want me to just bring down the blinds, please? Yours is on there.
Does it help?
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically the story with Microsoft Word was that they weren't going to meet their development schedule, and this was a problem, and they wanted to do something about it, right? And this is kind of the looking at what they did in order to make that happen and how that affected them in the long term. So if your goal is to conform to the development schedule, so there's that creates pressure to try actually to conform to that schedule, and there's a kind of quick fix applied in the guys who do this particular diagram have this little bit of jargon QF for an action that's a quick fix. But so a greater pressure to try actions and conform to the schedule leads to saying, okay, we'll do anything that we can to make you, the developers, conform to the schedule, to deliver the features in the time that we expect you to do. Right? So what that means is that in the short term, the developers start kind of hacking stuff to get stuff done quickly. Right? And again, that has a short-term effect of saying, oh, this is decreasing, because these guys use an O for opposite effect, for negative polarity. This is decreasing the time that it takes to add new features, right? So this is having an effect, this has, and as the time it takes to add new features decreases, so the variance from the original schedule decreases, and so the application of the quick fix here, the interaction between the pressure and the strategy that's being applied to respond to it is affected in turn. Right, so that's kind of one loop that's going on there. So we're saying, okay, in the short term, the pressure to get things done will make people hack stuff. Hacking stuff in the short term produces more features, and it means that we conform to the schedule. But there are other effects that flow out of this, which are the more that stuff is hacked, the less good, clean code is produced. So, and the less good, clean code is produced, in the long term means that there is greater duration and effort to add new features. So although there was the short-term effect of hacking stuff to get it out quickly, which meant that we got stuff more quickly, in the long term, there are going to be more problems with that. There's going to be an increase in the number of defects because we're hacking stuff. And also to work on stuff in the future, because we're not producing clean code now that future people will understand and be able to work on, we're increasing the duration and effort to add new features. So there's a whole kind of load of stuff interacting here. And then there's this other loop that's going on as well, which says the more that we kind of push the developers to meet the schedule, there's then also and that after a delay, this increases the duration between creating and fixing a defect, which in turn increases the duration and correctness in fixing defect, which basically creates more variance in the original schedule. So this is why you might think, oh, well, what we should do in order to meet the schedule is we should work harder, we should do more, we should get more code out, we should ship more features more quickly. But yeah, I mean, that will have a kind of short-term effect, but understanding the other dynamics of the system, understanding the long-term effects of an approach that says work harder and do more.
I think it's worth making a point that this is quite complicated to follow, but it's even more complicated to follow than if you didn't have a visual thing to go and point to the stuff. I think that's the point of having the diagram, right?
Yeah, because if you didn't have a diagram, this stuff would be invisible. This stuff would just be happening around you. That you'd be saying, well, we're getting people to, this is an after-the-fact analysis of what happened. And it's like, why did it happen in this way that actually we increased the reward for people to just complete code. We incentivized them, we paid them per line of code that they produced. Okay, so people just want to produce a lot of code and it doesn't matter to them whether it's good or bad. It just shows that you apply pressure to a system in one place, and the effect that you get overall is not necessarily going to be the effect that you're expecting.
But isn't it a little bit kind of for me, it's kind of too much form over what we're trying to do in this situation. So if I was thinking about it, I'd be like, okay, if I put more pressure on the people, these are the advantages, these are the disadvantages, and I can sort of group them in kind of long-term, short-term. But for me, there should be a much simple model to think about this. So if you say, okay, the advantage is X, the disadvantage is Z, you're gonna end up with something more or less the same. So I'm not entirely sure why this model is kind of so much more useful than just thinking about it in simple terms.
I don't know how to respond to that. I'm sorry, I don't. Yeah. I mean, we can stop now. I don't
Do you
mind.
have some more slides?
Yeah. But I don't know how to present them.
No, I'm not saying
continue.
at all that this is useless. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying, is there a way of doing this mental work using a simpler process? And I'm prepared to kind of like put it out there and see what comes back. I'm not at all saying that this is not worth kind of
I'm
debating.
thoroughly enjoying this.
Yeah.
Could you just run
I also
through?
think, I also think this is a good way to capture where there are things that maybe seem simple, but there are other things happening. So I'm finding it very useful.
Here's another example. Okay, maybe this is a simpler example. This is literally. I thought about this for kind of 5 minutes and sketched it together. So this is very, very simplified. But if we offer advanced funding as a standalone product, right? What we think that's going to do is, well, what impact is that going to have? So a couple of factors that might be at play here is, if we offer it as a standalone product, that means that we can have more sales of advanced funding to people who don't want to switch tax credit providers. And that obviously means that we get an increase in revenue from those sales. Similarly, if we offer advanced funding as a standalone product, we have those sales to people who currently don't want to switch, which increases the number of clients who have a good experience of some kind of interaction with us, which may create more people who want to switch, which in turn will increase our revenue. So, that is obviously a so there's obviously, it looks like there's a kind of reinforcing loop there, but there's also this loop going on here, which says, actually there's no loop there, because you can't follow the arrows all the way around.
There is a loop that you didn't draw, which is that the more revenue we get from advanced funding, the more we can go and get some extra funding resources to be able to offer more advanced funding. So there is a loop. That's not drawn yet.
Thank you. But there's another thing which is going on here, which is that if we offer advanced funding as a standalone product, this decreases our ability to use advanced funding as a hook to persuade people to switch. And that in turn means that it decreases our ability to get people to switch, which would decrease our revenue. So there are potentially these two balancing effects here that are going on at the same time. We offer it as a standalone product, and that gives us an opportunity to create switches, but it also takes away an opportunity to create switches. So we have to think, well, actually, which of those loops has a more powerful effect? And maybe we don't know. Maybe we have to go out and test it to find out. But there are these potentially two contradictory effects that are happening in the same system, and between them there will be an interaction, and one of them will be the dominant one, and that will create the characteristic of the system, which will be that advanced funding either leads us to increase our market share, or advanced funding causes us to decrease our market share. Is that a clearer example? This diagram is kind of complicated, and I struggle to explain it super clearly. But the interesting thing is that as Dan said, the situation is more complicated, and you can have a discussion around this diagram in a way that you can't have a discussion around stuff that's kind of just in your head, right? Because one of the things that we're trying to do, these next two slides kind of make a bit of the case, but also give a bit of a warning, right? These are models, and models are simplifications. And the reason why we put together as a model is that we're trying to explain why something behaves the way that it does. We're trying to explain why a system responds in a particular way. We're framing questions and problems and answers, and we're clarifying what's being considered and what's being excluded. So, on the diagram about population earlier, I said, okay, this is in a resource-constrained environment, because we were saying that as the population went up, the resource per person would go down. Well, in a non-resource constrained environment, and drawing and talking through the diagram is the most important thing to do, right? But also by practicing drawing the diagrams and talking about them, we're practicing systems thinking. We're starting to move our ability for, we're starting to move our thinking from just seeing the stuff that's in front of us to understanding that there are dynamics in play, and understanding how we can influence those dynamics. So we get to see the dynamics, we get to expose our mental models of what's going on in the world, and we get to expose the phenomenon of local optimization, where we should be looking for global optimization. So diagrams help us reason effectively and together about our mental models and assumptions. So when you're looking at any of these kind of diagrams, some useful questions to ask yourself, and some useful questions to ask when you're setting out to make a causal loop diagram. What's the problem being described? What are the major feedback loops, and what process do they capture? What are the timescales? So if there are delays, what are the delays? Because that's going to dictate, the speed at which you're going to expect to see effects. And which loops and variables are dominant, and also what's missing. So again, understanding the context, understanding is there anything else that we should be thinking about.
But which step do we start with?
We started with discussion.
That's what we're doing, with no thinking and no question at all.
Where are we?
Cool.
Oh, that's brilliant. It's very high quality. I don't know if I have a question.
Could you just do an example that you said of the, I can't remember the name, but the thing that you...
The tragedy of the commons.
Yeah, that's
Do you want an example?
I think...
So if you imagine a fishery stock, you take, population equals, growth equals population minus death times reproduction, right? And that gives you a number that's either 1 or less than 1. If it's less than 1, then when you minus catch, so minus taking the stuff out of it, you're in effect entering a tragedy of the commons, because you're very slowly decreasing the initial stock. And what happens is, as that number gets lower, so as it goes from 0.9 to 0.8 to 0.7, human behaviour often means that people will catch more, because as things become more scarce, they become more valuable. So in year 1, you'll go from 1 to 0.9, in year 2, you'll go from 0.9 to 0.7, and in year 3, you'll go from 0.7 to 0.4, because it becomes more and more valuable, so you catch quicker. And then when you get to 0, and there's stuff all left, everyone dies. And that's
It's like human selfishness.
It's human selfishness in reaction to
like
something called common pooled resources, which have a very low barrier to entry. So the Tragedy of Commons is actually based on a 1760s piece of writing from an economist called...
Yeah, come on.
He's on one of the notes. I think he's on the £20 notes. And he based it around farmers. I think it could be Garrett, yeah. So it's based on putting livestock on a common.
Adam Smith is on the £20 note.
I don't know the £20 note.
Is it the case that there's basically so like looking at the the dishes thing, that there's basically a linear cost to you of whether you get the dish clean or not, but there's an exponential loop going on there where...
No, I think the dish thing is more of an externality and a measurement of utility.
Like, because we wait 15 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, it is like, somebody's here, it's right out.
Okay, cool beans.
Well, there's a diagram there for the dishes.
Is
Anyone
it?
want to try and explain this?
Proper.
I think this is more a collective reduction utility.
It's like you've got dirty dishes, and then everybody's eating the dirty dishes, so you just add them to the pile.
Yeah, that's not Tragedy of the Commons. It says it's a frustrating oscillating pattern.
Yeah. So that's a detrimental discount rate.
So it's just like any animal that's going extinct, right?
I wouldn't worry about that. It's just
But like the Tragedy of the Commons thing, is, and if an animal's going extinct,
if what?
If any animal is going extinct,
It's any common pool resource that's consumed beyond its sustainable level. So common pool resource is anything that's free to access. Like, it could be, imagine eating from a bowl with everyone around the table, right? It's got to feed 2 meals. So you can sit down and stand up whenever you like, but you need a certain amount of calories out of that bowl as a whole group, But you'll overeat on your first meal because you're worried that other people will get that resource, and then your second meal you don't get enough calories, so you go hungry. And that's the tragedy in the common. It's the common pool resource is the bowl of food in the middle, and you overconsume beyond sustainability. and then it links into having so it relies on having a fixed amount of resources. So you act within a constraint. Same thing true with money or oil and gas. You know, there's growth for growth's sake in the economy. And then if you put that in like a framework of you either correct it through like the Promethean argument, which is that you'll innovate your way out of it by sort of Prometheus stole the fire from the gods, or you have like the Club of Rome argument, which is that actually you're on a spaceship and you've only got a limited amount of resources. So it depends which. It's not always a bad thing. So fisheries are managed with a discount rate, where they accept a certain amount of reduction in the amount of stock per year, maybe 3.5%, but ultimately that might not be sustainable. So,
Nice work.
of the year of my life in 45 seconds.
Do we want to explain the diagram?
I can't explain it.
I can.
Go on.
There's basically just two lines that go in towards the dirt. So the main thing is the dirty dishes, and there's just two lines that go into it: adding to the pile from the top right and cleaning from the bottom left. Those are the lines that either add to the dirty dishes or remove the dirty dishes. And then there's a bunch of things that happen because the dirty dishes are there that cause either more adding to the pile, or more cleaning, or less adding to the pile. So on the left, for example, left up, as there's more dirty dishes, people get hopeless and annoyed, so therefore they're less likely to clean, therefore that reduces the reduction of dirty dishes.
It's not really tragedy of the commons.
No, it's not tragedy of the commons. It says below it's a frustrating oscillating pattern. That must be the technical term for it.
What does this tell us? Because like this
tells us to me the important thing is there's a whole bunch of interactions that it's not about like somebody's fault, somebody's being an asshole there. There's a whole bunch of complex interactions leading to lots of dirty dishes, and importantly there's the fact that people are busy at the top right, which is pushing into this thing and causing more adding to the pile, which is inevitable basically.
It shows that shit collects shit, you know.
It shows more than that shit collects shit. It shows that there's that external busyness thing at the top right, which is not in the feedback loop, which you can't influence. It's not being influenced by any guilt tripping or any cleaning or anything. There's always going to be that pushing of dirty dishes because people are busy and sometimes they're going to add to the pile. And as soon as that starts, it starts this whole cycle of like endless interactions that leads to people feeling guilty and guilt tripping each other and like getting hopeless and so on. So it's all just because we're busy. So stop beating yourself up about it.
But I think in terms of why I think this stuff is important is because we're working in a case where we've got loads and loads of systems and you have different outputs, different things happening, and you can possibly attribute reasons to things, but if you're not trying to understand the whole system, then you might be kind of trying to fix the problem in the wrong way. Or
So looking at
just point to an action, because what I'm interested in is a conclusion which is tangible. So if this was to tell me like we need to do less of this or more of that.
Looking at this, we could be stuck in the thing where we're saying, well, we need to make people feel bad about adding to the pile. That's the thing that we're doing to try and stop the dirty dishes. It's something that we did do in Good Street. Get people to be personally responsible for the fact that they're adding to the dish stuff. Because we're just focusing on this thing, we're just focusing on one of these routes, and we're ignoring the system as a whole. Whereas looking at the system as a whole allows us to actually have a conversation where we can actually, rather than just somebody saying, well, it's just because we're busy, we can say, this is the system, it's a complicated system, it's being pushed by this. As long as we're busy, we're going to have this system being triggered over and over again. So let's accept the fact that we need a solution that's also external to this system, rather than just trying to push on personal responsibility. Now this is for something as simple as the dirty dishes in the sink. We do a few things that are slightly more complicated than dealing with dirty dishes. And so having this kind of diagram might help identify things that aren't obvious to spot, basically.
You get to understand the forces at play in a complex situation where an assumption could be very easy and very easily a misleading thing to take out of it.
Okay, so the purpose of this is to generate this discussion that will hopefully generate some kind of action or like some.
It's a
well, as
deep-
long as that's what it is, like, I totally get it. I totally get it.
It's a discussion tool to broaden the perspective of the discussion as well. So it's not just about people aren't taking personal responsibility about the dirty dishes, but about what is the overall system and why is it happening like this.
So for me, I'm going to use this, I think, directly with trying to explain what the situation is with advanced funding and how it's actually panning out. And I'll build something like this, which I would have originally just gone through in a list. Oh, this is this, this is this. But I can probably get the whole map out and sort of figure out how it is. And then that way, as a discussion field, point to the parts that are adding value, what's taking away, and are we net positive, and what we should do in terms of going forward.
Okay, cool.
It's also potentially good for, I know Stephen Kuhn gave us advice about testing different things and trying to just test one thing at a time, which we're, I think, possibly quite bad at because we want to do all the things. And so if you can see how testing 3 or 4 things at the same time, you know, which things feed into what and which forces, you know.
But what you just said, Rowan, was really interesting because how, on the basis of that diagram, because you said, it will help you figure out the way next level, positive, negative. I hope like currently I'm not seeing like how that gives you a reading in terms of is this worth doing or is this not worth doing. So I can see how it shows you different forces at play, I get that, but how do you come to that conclusion?
So you put weightings on the kind of the positives and negatives there and the delays, and kind of you can kind of translate that some way into like you know, a value proposition. So figuring out costs, revenue, and applying it in that, you can give some kind of weighting, and like so.
So I think with some kind of weighting, I'm starting to see how that'd be very, because then it shows you something. It results in a like, whoa, like that's an insight. It gives you an insight that then generates an action.
It's like the business model canvas, but for a process. So you know, it makes the thing visible. So instead of just having an abstract conversation about like, there's something wrong with your business, I can't quite put my finger on it, or I think it might be something to do with the sale. You have it visually there, and you're like, okay, yeah, your channel there is not going to work, or you need to test the channel because I don't think it's going to work.
I think it'd be super interesting to see if you think that you could implement like some numbers within that model, or like add like way, because that's what I was thinking, like. Which factors are weighing in more than other, like that is for me more valuable to determine that than, oh, this influences that. It's more like, okay, which influence is stronger and by how much?
I think that's, I would imagine that that's the next step.
It's really the biggest factor. So yeah, link next time.
Okay, I'm gonna stop recording.